So I've been asked what lessons I've learned from 31 years being on the board of what's now Bendigo and Adelaide Bank. Thinking about that, I thought I probably needed some help to get some of those lessons straight. So I've asked my friend Ian Harper to help me. Ian, you've played roles in not just academia, but in regulators. You were the Fair Work Commissioner. Perhaps most significantly for the banking industry, you were on the Wallace Report. We've seen a lot of change in those 31 years in banking markets. Banking is now accessible to all sorts of people in the community in ways that we just wouldn't have imagined 31 years ago. Those days, the role of building societies was really there because it gave access to people who were shut out of the regular banking system. The banking system was a very structured, patriarchal...
Well, that's right. It was heavily constrained and regulated, and really the loans were rationed out, basically, because the banks were forbidden from paying market rates of interest on their deposits, and therefore they had a limited amount of money to lend. And they decided to whom they would lend it. Whereas building societies and credit unions were outside that net, and they really grew because of the restrictions that were placed on banks in those days.
Now, of course, we all have immediate access via our mobile phone wherever we are in the world at any time of the day or night. And credit is available in ways that at all points of a transaction that we wouldn't have thought of in those days. Making banking available to the broader population is one of the great kind of democratic forces that we've been able to unleash.
It is a public utility.
And it is a terribly important, crucial role in everyone's lives. So it's a very important business that we've been involved in for that time.
Yeah, that's right, Robert. And the fact that it's been important for people's lives, that bit isn't new. And in fact, the banking system has failed people on a number of occasions during our history, which makes it interesting as well. And yet it's one of those things that you know, in some sense, you can't live without it, and it's difficult to live with it. And there's an ongoing tension, which we see played out over that 30-year period as well, even until very recent, current times.
And I often talk about the history of what's now Bendigo and Adelaide Bank. It was formed by a group of people shut out of the banking system, as it then was, who pooled their resources in the form of a building society, pooled their resources and took it in turns to get houses for each other.
Yes.
It's a fantastic story about people working together in a common endeavour within the framework of a private company to achieve social private purposes. Of course, banks today are very different from those. We're now very large organisations. The bank is now well over 100 times bigger than it was when I joined the Building Society Board.
Yeah, that'd be right.
Our reach within the community is far broader than it was. And of course, the interest of governments and regulators is much more intrusive than it was.
Yeah.
And we've seen big changes in the way that banks are regulated in that time. After 30 years, you think back on the kind of big issues about what's the point of it all.
Yeah.
And I think one thing I've been lucky in being involved in this organisation for is that it's always been important. You know that there are people out there that it matters that we exist and that we do our business the way we do our business. You know, it mattered to my mother-in-law that as a single woman she was able to get a loan to buy a house when others wouldn't give it to her. It matters to people in Rapanyup that they've got a local branch, local bank that makes profits that goes to support the local football club. And I think it matters too that when we have events like the Hayne Royal Commission, that at least there's one organisation that can stand up and say, yeah, we did do our best to look after customers and have a good balance between those various stakeholders. So I think as a director, as an employee, I mean, you know yourself, it's important to work in a place where you think what you're doing actually matters.
I have to say that over the length of time that I've known you and your colleagues and former colleagues have worked with the bank, it's always been obvious that that ethos of service, that ethos of purpose has been evident in everything that the bank has done. I mean, it's no surprise that the bank chose to go with the community banking model, not as just another commercial product, but as something which actually encapsulated that ethos of service and community building. And I think the bank has been justifiably praised and recognised for that over the years. Robert, I'd be really interested to hear from you what you regard as the highlights of the period of 31 years that you've been working with the bank.
Some of the highlights have been mostly with the people that you end up working with. Some of the people who are in second and third generation families who have been involved with the organisation, and people who've been introduced to it for the first time.
So as you come to the end of your term, what would you say that is something that you're most proud of?
Well, I'm proud that the organisation is fundamentally still so strong, so healthy, but which hasn't forgotten those values. Sure, I'm proud of the amount of growth we've done and all the people that we've worked with and all the customers who've had the benefit of the technologies and all those things. Yeah, proud of all those things. But most proud to have the privilege of being part of what's really a great organisation.
If I were you, I'd look back with a great deal of warmth and frankly pride at what you and your colleagues have been able to achieve.
I do, Ian, but I also feel it's important to remember you can't take this stuff for granted. There's a fragility in all these endeavours. It's easy to look back and in 31 years talk about how it went from a market value of 30 million to now 5.5 billion, went from 600 million of assets to 70-something billion of assets, and think, it was all inevitable, it's all... But at every point there were decisions made when the existence of the organisation was in peril. And it's fragile going forward. So there's a huge responsibility that I'm handing on to others.
That's true, but also the outlook that you've just described, that fragility, that's about risk. And you could respond to that fragility by going back into your shell, right? That's not what the institution did. That's not what you did. Certainly you didn't drive the institution as chair with that idea in mind. You need to take those carefully thought through risks which are bounded and directed by that ethos, by the culture we spoke about before. All of those things have to be cultivated, an appropriate risk attitude, the systems that are necessary, the earnestness of the people who work for the institution. And, you've embodied lots of that. You've brought those things to your time at the bank, Robert. So from me to you, congratulations. It's a wonderful period to look back on. And not just the institution and its shareholders and its members, but the country is richer for the fact that Bendigo and Adelaide Bank has been the success story that it has.
Thank you very much, Ian.
My great pleasure.